Okay.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your kindness, buddy. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. No, I had a beard when I was in Iceland too. As soon as I found out how ugly I was, the beard came on, man, just as quick as I could grow some little hairy things on there to cover it up. Some men are really lucky; they can shave it and be okay. And I shaved mine off when my daughters were real little. I have three daughters, and they were all standing there watching me when I shaved it. And I turned around and smiled at them, and they all three started crying. And I went, "Okay, all right, it's time to grow it back. It's just sorry, girls, that won't happen again." So, God, it's so cool to be here. It's so cool that you guys are embracing the idea of a book study, and a lot of us take for granted the book study stuff. And I got to tell you, somebody asked me the other day if what the most important thing that had come out of the Zoom meetings, and I said, hands down, the most important thing that I saw that came out of Zoom stuff was for the last 2.5 years, where there were literally thousands and thousands of people that were introduced to book studies that never ever had been in a book study before, and they were able to connect dots that they never ever could connect before. And I totally dig that. I mean, I lived that nightmare. Let me ask you, how many of um, y'all ever stop and think about the most important day of your life, the most important thing that ever happened? I mean, I've been married for 40 years, and I'll never forget the night that I met my wife, and I thought she was an angel that had just slipped into the room. I don't the prettiest girl I've ever seen in my whole life, and all of that was important. The day I sobered up was hugely important. Um, but over the years, as I've gotten older, and I tend to reflect more now. Um, the thing that I think was the most important night, the most important thing that ever happened, was when I finally got the courage to go introduce myself to a crusty old guy named Cliff Bishop, who was a big book guy that was sponsored by Joe McQuaney in Dallas, Texas. And at the end of a 7-year run in AA, I was suicidal and nuttier than a squirrel turd. I was really as in bad a shape as I could get, just trying to stay sober one day at a time. And Chris, my twin, introduced me to Krusty Cliff, and he changed everything. That meeting, that single meeting, changed everything about how I looked at this. And so, what I really would like to do is talk about a little of that tonight, a little bit of that. Uh, this the things that we take for granted, and the things I think sometimes we just sell ourselves short. I did for a long time. Um, I don't know, guys. How many of y'all have ever dated a girl and then run her off, and then later regretted it like a big dog because you realized how special she was? I mean, am I the only one stupid enough to do that? I've done that a couple of times. And this is the stuff, is that sometimes hindsight is 2020, and we began to look at these things, and all I can see is Myers Raymer spending 7 years in AA, just going to meetings, not working the steps, not sponsoring people, not developing a relationship with my creator. And I got so amazingly unhappy, that it was just, I don't know. We used to have an old guy that Dave was the only name I ever knew him for, like that. And he used to sit in a meeting, and every time he introduced himself, he'd go, "Hi, my name is Dave, and I'm sober today." And he would say it just like that. And we were just going like, "God dang, Dave, thanks for pulling us with the wonderful vision of how cool this stuff could be. I mean, you sound like you're in complete bondage." It was just kind of a crazy deal. Um, um, just, just crazy. I need to tell you a little piece of story because it affects the rest of the story, and I tried talking about this stuff without it, and people are having a hard time connecting the dots, and I don't blame them. Um, the I I sobered up January 15th of '88. I'm a goofy drunk that also got hooked up in a bunch of outside issues the last 6 or 7 months that I drank, it was pretty much of a nightmare. My wife, who is my business partner, I'm a bookbinder by trade. Some of y'all might remember books. I don't know. Maybe yeah, some of you in here are old enough to remember what a book is. There you go. Ramona knows all about it. But that's what I've done all my life, and the Londa's been my business partner, and so she would hold everything together while we had one little baby girl, and then I finally fell apart completely, and she said, "No way, Jose, I'm done." And so she's living in the other end of the house, and it's just pretty uncomfortable. Um, I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to do. Eventually, through a couple of things that happened, and I ended up. Chris took me to my first meeting in AA. I fell in love with the room. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with all of that. I knew every little aphorism off the wall. Think, think, think. Just don't drink. Just 90 and 90. I knew everything like that. But at 7 years sober, I couldn't tell you who the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous were. I didn't know because we never studied the book. 32 meetings a week, and we didn't have one book study. 32 meetings a week. I know everything about your shopping problems. I know everything about your porn issue. I know everything about everything, but I don't know anything about a solution that would get me clear of this nightmare that was this addiction. Um, and and it was be goofy. I spent 2 years going to those meetings, and I'm better. Londa's kind of digging me a little bit. We ended up having another little baby girl, and I think everything's going to be okay. And then somewhere between the second year and third year, and some of y'all will relate to what I'm talking about, I began to get, although I didn't know what it was, I began to get restless, irritable, and discontent. And I'm struggling trying to function. I'm just I'm eating too much ice cream every evening. I'm spending a ton of money on things I don't need. I don't know. I learned how to fly after I got sober, and ended up buying an airplane. And then a little while later, I ended up buying another airplane. And then a little while later, for whatever reason, the scratch was there and I figured I had to itch it. So I bought another airplane. So now I have 3 airplanes, 2 aircraft hangars, and I can't afford one. Um, my wife is beside herself trying to figure out how we're going to keep all these folks. We have 14 employees, and it was just a pretty much of a nightmare. But it kept getting worse and worse. I've got anxiety disorders I'm trying to deal with, and then the anxiety stuff we finally get it done, taken care of with medication, and then this depression comes back, and I don't. I have a soft spot in my heart for men and women who deal with depression, um, because it's some scary stuff, and I just, to not be able to get up in the morning and go to work and not be able to function. I'm back to scaring my family, and they don't know who I am and what's going on. They didn't know any of my friends. They didn't know what we were doing in those A&A meetings, and I wasn't telling her. And so things aren't really fun at home. Um, I'm coming up on 7 years sober, and I know that I'm not gonna stay sober. I'm gonna drink for sure. It'll either be one of two things. I'll either drink or I'll kill myself because the depression is killing me. I don't want to live that way. I don't know what to do, and so I'm going to try to check out, leave, and the and that didn't work out either. What finally ended up happening was that I almost drank one night. It scared me real bad, and I don't want to drink, but I just sort of checked out in a convenience store one night with a 6 pack of beer sitting in front of me, and then realized what I was doing, and I just went, "Oh, this is insanity. This is crazy." And so I went ahead and went home, and I called Chris. Now Chris had moved to the Texas Hill Country down where I am now, and had got a sponsor, a cat by the name of Mark Houston, big book guy, and had introduced Chris to a pretty effective way to live his life, and introduced him to some literature called the Big Book, the basic text. And I owned one of them, but I never read that book. And so I figured maybe I ought to try that. And Chris introduced me to Cliff, and it was sort of altering in a way that I can't hardly explain. I have a vivid image of what I was like I'm 2 or 3 weeks shy of 7 years sober when I met Clifford. And I remember like it was yesterday what I was like. The recovery was a bondage that I couldn't get clear of. Every day was how we keep ourselves sober one day at a time. And I'm just barely getting by. And it's just, I don't understand what was going on. And it would take a couple of weeks in a book study before I finally started connecting some dots up. And I went, holy cow. That's the guy that, oh, I get it. That's that guy. And that's that guy. And and it all started coming together. My plan was to go over to that book study with Clifford for a little bit. And then I was going to go back over to my original home group and be this sort of iconic big book guy. And I was going to, be special. And, guys, I never went back. I never went back to that other meeting. I stayed in Dallas, and it's a 55-minute drive to that meeting with no traffic. And in Dallas, that doesn't happen. And I would do that for years and years and years. And but it was a life changer because I realized how much different I felt as I began to understand the differences between. So, I mean, I want to read something to you. And over on page 75, there's a little fifth step promises that sit in there. I just want to read something to you and connect some dots, and then I'll get off this story stuff and we'll move into some funner stuff to talk about. Halfway down that page, it says, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We feel we're on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. I mean, but listen, guys, stop and think about this. Walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. I mean, that's some heady stuff, but it explains when these folks put this thing together, it explains a way of life that I didn't even expect it existed. I thought everything about AA was, how do we keep sober every day? We'll stay sober a day at a time. It would take me a year in those book studies to realize that our basic text never, ever says that. They say we stay sober for good and for all, but we live life one day at a time. Two distinctly different things, distinctly. All of a sudden the burden went away, and I began to realize how much of this was about something that was really important that I'd never seen before. Years later, there was a guy in a meeting. He was a nice old guy, sober 35 years or so at the time, and he'd gotten into a pissing contest with some people on a public beach. He had a dog that wasn't on a leash, and people got mad at him, and the cops got called, and he was going on, and he spent like 15 minutes in that meeting telling us this story about this dog thing. And I'm just kind of scratching my head going, where is this going? And eventually he stopped. And then I took a deep breath, and then he leaned forward. He said, and before any of you big book guys step in and say anything, I'm just going to tell you real quick, there's nothing in this big book about how to live your life. It's about how we stay sober one day at a time. And he set his book back down on the table. I think it's the first time he'd ever picked it up. But I remembered sitting back. It was a candlelight meeting, and so the lights were all off. And the guys that I had taken over there, I talked to them the next morning, and they said, Myers, we could literally see steam coming out of your ears in that dim light. And I started laughing, and I said, yeah, it was. I didn't say anything because I figured I was pretty emotional about what I was hearing. Folks, as you study the text, you'll begin to see so quickly how many reoccurring themes there are in the big book, how many prayers and promises and directions, all of these things that come together to teach us how we can live a life so amazingly transformed that we didn't even know that it was possible. I never ever understood that. So yeah, I sometimes I think I don't ever want folks to think that I'm spanking anybody. Um, but I got to tell you, when my oldest daughter, she was the only daughter that saw me drunk. She was 3.5 when I sobered up, and she's in the program now. She's in recovery and doing great. But the moment she walked into a room, everything began to change for me. Everything shifted because I began to hear what she was hearing, and I would begin to hear people share things that were confusing, and they would share. Nobody meant anybody any harm. Let me ask you, how many of y'all have ever sat in a meeting and heard conflicting pieces of information in the meeting you're sitting in, and you're just kind of going, well, wow, I get that. I know what I'm doing. Well, that's wonderful, Hoss. I'm glad you know what you're doing. But what about the little shaken dude or dudette that just walked in the room and they don't know crap? They're all they know is that they're in a room full of the kindest, sweetest people that they've ever met so far. They truly are blessed to be there, and I love that idea. But guys, we need to stop and think sometimes how much confusion we create in some of these meetings by most of this has to do with the format of the meeting. If the format lets you share anything that you want to share, then people are going to do that. But how often do we find ourselves with pieces of conflicting information? Work the steps quickly. Take your time. It's no race. Well, what do? You see, one of the nicest ladies I ever met in AA pulled me aside one time after she shared, and she said, Myers, she said, I really meant that when I said I never worked the steps to stay sober. And I said, yeah, I heard you say that, but I didn't understand. She said, oh, yeah, I never felt the need to work the steps. I said, well, how did you stay sober? And she said, I practice yoga. And I went, cool. Cool. And I'm not ragging on yoga. I totally dig yoga. I practiced myself for 10 years. Wish I still was doing it. Maybe I could bend over. This getting old stuff is goofy. But I got to tell you guys that all of these different opinions and different ideas. Let me ask you this, just because we're in a room with some book people. If we talk to folks in a meeting about working the work in a timely fashion, or it's not a race, take your time, which lines up with the text more than the other one? One of them lines up real well. I understand it's not a race. The book even tells us at one place we need to be careful about moving people too quickly through stuff. But the book, what part of next we launched out on a course of vigorous action? Next. It's moving us through this thing in a timely fashion so that we can get on through it, have this experience, and begin to experience that transformation on that promise that I just read, which is badass. Let me ask you, how many of y'all have ever been in a situation where you've experienced folks in our rooms that are really, really willing at one point to do whatever's necessary to get sober, and then later they're not so willing? You ever notice that? Like that, they can be. I mean, I've seen newcomers that would do anything you ask them to do. If you handed them a big old fuzzy spider and said, "Here, would you eat this?" They'd say, "Yeah, oh yeah, sure. Can I have a napkin?" I mean, they're so willing to do something. But I've also seen those same people 2 weeks later come in get coffee, walk back outside, sit by themselves, yawn at people. I mean, they're bored spitless. They're not getting anything out of the program yet. And does that make any sense? How often do we see people that we let the youngest, newest person in the room dictate how they're going to work the steps? Listen, I'm not a big one on giving orders to people. I don't think that's effective, and I don't like it when people give me orders. But why would I want the sickest kid in the room to decide that he's going to take 6 months to work the steps? Why would I do that? And yet I hear it all the time. Well, he'll tell me when he's ready. No, Hoss, I don't think that's how that's going to happen at all. What he's going to do is he'll get loaded, he'll leave, and then we can say stupid things like, well, the booze will bring him back or whatever. I've said it 1,000 times. It's crazy to think that way. So let me ask you, how many of y'all have ever heard a guy named Alan McGinnis? Alan McGinnis was a guy he'd been around a long time. He had originally done a talk, and they transcribed the talk into a brochure called A Member's Eye View of AA. That you can still get it. It's still out there like that. And I want to read you one little piece of paragraph. It's a long drawn out thing, but this one little piece here. There it is. There is a widely held belief in AA that if a newcomer will simply continue to attend meetings, something will finally rub off on you. And the implication, of course, is that the something which rubs off will be this so-called miracle of AA. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that many people in AA accept this statement quite literally. I've observed them over the years. They faithfully attend meetings, faithfully waiting for something to rub off. The funny part about it is the something that is rubbing off on them is death. They sit there week after month after year while mental, spiritual, and physical rigor mortis slowly sets in. Now listen, before you completely discount this guy as an idiot, he was brilliant guy when you read some of the stuff that he wrote like this. But what I want you to remember about this thing is he wrote it 60 years ago. 60 years ago is when this was written. He was trying to tell us all of that time ago to be really, really careful and to pay attention to what was important in the meetings. I mean, folks, we have the Grapevine magazine, which is supposedly our meeting in print, that several years ago published one of their magazines that had don't drink and go to meetings on their cover. Y'all understand? I just think that there's more here. And I think this is what McGinnis was talking about. I think this is what Clarence Snyder and Mitchell Kay and some of these people that wrote stuff later on. This is what a lot of people were writing. Stop and think about why Bill Wilson put himself out there and took headshot after headshot from folks when he was writing the traditions. Why do you think he was doing that? Why do you think he suffered that way, like that? Because he knew and understood that we would, on our own, destroy the very fellowship that saved our life, that we would destroy it. And this is the reason why he needed to codify some ideas. And these days, people kick it to the curb, and I talk to people all the time about their knowledge of the traditions and what they think about them like that. And I'm blown away how often people will say, never read it, not interested. It just looked like boring crap to me. Well, okay, I get it. The concepts affected me that way, but the traditions didn't. And the traditions were bona fide, but it tried to help us get kind of connected up. So I'm going to 32 meetings a week. I'm not going to every one of them, but there have 32 meetings a week where the club that I originally sobered up in, and they're all discussion meetings, no literature meetings. And then one day somebody showed me this letter from Bill Wilson in 1966. Some of you have heard this. This is why sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teaching and practice of AA's 12 steps, is the sole purpose of the group. If we don't stick to this cardinal principle, we shall almost certainly collapse. And if we collapse, we cannot help anyone. Y'all, y'all understand that? I mean, they were being as direct as we could as early as the '60s. They were trying to tell us this stuff. There was another little piece here. There was a on the GSO handbook on page 53 of the this is our handbook in New York. The sole purpose of an AA group is to offer sobriety through the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. Well, so forgive me for being critical. I don't want to be like that, but I'm in our rooms for 7 years and don't even know anything about the steps. And everybody co-signs it like it's okay because you're here one day at a time, Myers. I'm suicidal and my family hates my guts because I'm an idiot. I'm just a knucklehead, you see? And nobody wants to say, Myers, maybe you ought to do something to transform yourself, transform it to something different by looking at this work. As if everything that we do is about how to move from where we are in the darkness of our disease and to move over and stand in the sunlight of the Spirit, that's some heady stuff that a crazy, crusty old bastard from Central Texas could move from where he was to standing in the sunlight of the Spirit and having my life transformed in such a way that I could effectively help others, that I could effectively be a dad, be a husband, be an employer. You see how important that stuff is? All of it was about how to live my life. Everything in the book was about that. The handful of pages about how to work the steps. And once you get done with that, the rest of it is brilliantly laid out in an order that made lots of sense, that we're going to move towards something that we don't even understand, and we're going to have this cool experience. Have y'all ever thought about how weird it is that we ask newcomers that to, let's say Babe is a brand new guy. He just walked into the room. I'm just looking right at you now, buddy. It's good to know you. Let's just say that he walks into a room and he's brand new, and we're going to ask him to move towards recovery, this idea of being recovered. And he's looking at me going like, okay, yeah, that'd be great. And then in the back of his mind, he's going, that bearded idiot is an idiot. What does that mean? We ask people every day to move towards something, but they don't know what it is. You see, the basic text was a great way to figure out and to see what it is. And it also was the greatest piece of motivational stuff that I ever read, because I would read a promise and I would go, that's some badass stuff right there. I want that. I want that. And then the next question that also fed my motivation is it possible that I could have that? I mean, I've talked to Ramona about this a couple of times like that. I think Kim and I've talked about this stuff too at one point in time, that how often have you looked at promises and then ever taken a moment or two to ask yourself the question whether or not that promise has manifested in your life? Is that real in your life? I mean, am I the only guy in this room that has ever thought that Bill Wilson was full of crap and that he was just writing this stuff to sell books, that none of this was really possible? That, I mean, it was just goofy stuff, until I remember talking to Mark Houston one night at a deal, and Mark goes, man, Myers, I smell more. And I remember laughing at him when he said it. And then later, sitting still by myself, I went, I think he was serious. I think that he was serious. And what he was trying to say was that there's so much more that our literature offers us, but so many of us have kind of withered down into this idea that this is all about staying sober one day at a time. And that's all that there is. Guys, listen, I was doing a friend of mine had asked me to do him a favor and introduce him at a club where he belonged. He wasn't going to the same group that I was going to. This was in Dallas, and he was a member of a real fancy AA group. And Nothing wrong with being real fancy, but anyway, it was they wouldn't let me in, but it was real fancy. And so I remember going to this meeting one night, and they had like 12 or 13 people were were picking up birthday chips, and this guy was 3/4 of the way through the evening. I was introducing him, and I did. And, there were two things about that evening that I noticed that really jumped out at me. One, the only two people in the room that had a big book was him, the guy I was introducing, and me, because I always have my big book. I mean, I don't. If I go to the bathroom, I have my big book everywhere. I always take it with me. So um, the other thing that really caught me off guard was out of I think they had 12 or 14 people that picked up uh, uh, birthday things that night. And there were three or four that said almost exactly the same thing. And this is what it said. And it made me smile at first. And then later it made me want to cry a little bit. Because what they all those four people said was this, you know, I just don't know how I got here. And then they would go on and talk for just a little bit. And I, guys, I know exactly how I got 34 years sober. I know exactly how I did that. What happened? God, I cleared out a bunch of stuff, stood in the sunlight of the Spirit. God changed my life forever. And I've been able to stay sober and affect change in other people, and which is the sweetest thing in the whole wide world. I mean, I understand people trying to be humble. Oh, I just don't know how I got here. Listen, wouldn't a better story, wouldn't a better idea to relate to new people in the room was, I know exactly how I got here. This is exactly what I did when I followed directions and did what they asked me to do. I mean, doesn't that, maybe it's just me, I don't know, it just seems to work better. Chris used to always talk about pulling people with a vision of what AA is like. And I'm thinking, guys, I totally dig that idea. We have these days, y'all, we have tens of thousands of people coming into AA. And we let them just sort of build their own view of what AA is about. They listen to Oprah, and they listen to Dr. Phil, and they listen to all these. I mean, I'm not ragging on anybody, but damn, I mean, you have a million clinical folks that are not members of Alcoholics Anonymous that want to tell you about Alcoholics Anonymous. And then we end up, and I love clinical stuff, guys. I love treatment. I've had the great fortune of working in several treatment places part-time, and have absolutely enjoyed what I learned and what I saw. But guys, it's no wonder that people have such weird ideas about what recovery is supposed to look like. Something, I don't know what, but something at some point in time, I think that's a common thread that runs through most of us. We'll just sort of get to a place eventually where we're willing to set down all of the things that we think we know about AA and be willing to look at what we want to keep as real. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to study the text, is to study the big book. It doesn't matter how many nice people you got around you. It doesn't matter who your trophy sponsor is. It doesn't matter how many meetings you're going to. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand what this program is in a way so that you can teach it. Guys, I spent 10, let's see, I was almost 10 years sober, and I had never sponsored anybody. 7 years I didn't at the other group. And then when I got over to the book study things, I'm around a bunch of book guys, and they know their stuff and I don't necessarily. And I just said, I'm going to always suck at it. So I'm just not going to do it. Any of y'all ever do that? Y'all ever crawl up in your head, tell yourself you're not going to do something because of your own self-evaluation? It's crazy, because we see ourselves, weird. Bob Darrell used to say years ago, said that we're the turd in our own punch bowl, and it's the truth. I mean, we can just Our head's a weird place sometimes, y'all. I mean, how many of y'all have ever had a list with 10 names that you needed to make an amends to, and you're ready to rock and roll, and then you just sit on it, do nothing, and then do nothing, and then do nothing, and eventually you look at the list and go, you know what? These these turds, I don't need to make amends to half these guys. They deserve what they got. I don't need to do anything. Pretty soon you've talked yourself out of the whole thing. We see the exact same thing around inventory. How many of y'all have ever seen people who were ready and willing to do inventory? They're actually writing it. They're actually getting ready to share it with you. Everything is going great. And then somebody says, oh, this has happened to me so many times, it makes me want to throw up. How many times this has happened, because I sponsor lots of men in other places. And they'll call me later and go, well, there was a guy in my home group that said that probably I'm going too fast with this, and I probably need to just sort of, I'm just going to chill a bit. And then, so I want to be thorough. I want you to understand that. And I said, you can be thorough and fast. You can do that. You don't have to. We can do 2 inventories if something else comes up. How about that? Well, I'll get back with you. And they never do. They never do. It's just one of those things. Remember that little piece, of solitary self-appraisal, that little part like that is seldom sufficient. Let me crawl up in my head and I'll convince myself that I'm going to be inadequate, that I'm not going to be sufficient. And that's what we don't want. If there are 2 key things that I want you to hear me say tonight, one of them is that Dr. Bob's original statement of trust God, clean house, help others. I used to laugh my ass off every time I heard that, because I thought it was so stupid, because I thought there was lots more than that. I mean, it's just, and the reality, as I've gotten older looking at it, there really isn't. This is what it comes down to. These disciplines of 10, 11, and 12 at the end of the steps on this kind of things, y'all, these are hugely important. In treatment land, when people leave, if Kim's in treatment and he leaves and goes home, and I'm part of his aftercare stuff, they give you a script. All the treatment centers do that, is they'll give you a script. And so when I call Kim, I'm going to ask him some questions. You know what the first question, always, on everyone I've ever seen, the first question on there is, hey, Kim, how many meetings do you go into? That's it. That's it. And I'm just, I usually take the list and slide it aside, because I've got my own list that I want to do like this. Because what I want to know when I talk to Kim is, Kim, let me ask you a couple of questions, buddy. How much time are you spending with your creator every day? And then we have a little conversation. You're either spending some time or you're not. And I don't really care what the answer is, but the way you answer is going to determine where this conversation goes. The next question I'm going to ask is, how much time are you spending with God's kids? I just, because this is huge stuff. The single most reoccurring theme in the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous is work and self-sacrifice for others, working with others. And yet we live in a time, a season, if you will, in AA, where we have tens of thousands of people that think that 12-step work is optional, that 12-step work is something you do when you got nothing else to do, or when I don't know, you want to impress somebody. I don't know. I wasn't about to do it. And they finally tricked me and made me go do a little 12-step deal at the Salvation Army. And then they didn't show up. So I had to take the reins and do it. I'll never forget that night standing there in front of a chain link fence, a security fence, getting ready to go into this place. And I'm looking around hoping somebody else is going to show up, and they didn't. And I had to make the decision. Either I'm going to go in and do something, or I'm going to leave, which puts us as a group in jeopardy. By the way, let me just mention real quick, that group that I belonged to in Dallas before we moved down here to Central Texas, that group had 52 commitments a week right before COVID. That's 52 places that we're carrying the message, other than the 3 meetings that we had there at that church. That's a lot of people. And every one of those 52 meetings were book studies. There was not a single discussion meeting anywhere in there. And it was amazingly effective to be able to carry that kind of message and try to help those men and women as gently as we could set another baseline to understand. Bill Wilson talks about a common solution over on page 17. Buddy, that common solution is huge. But I'm amazed at how many men that I've worked with over the years that didn't know anything. And I would never judge them, because that was me in a nutshell. But they just don't know anything about the basic text. So listen, y'all are clear on that. If I'm trying to help Amy and I don't know what the disease of alcoholism is, I can sit in front of Amy and we can swap stories. She can tell me a story and I can tell her a story like this, and she'll smile at me and I'll smile at her, because we can relate story wise. We've connected on that level like that. But at some point in time, she's going to look at me and she's going to stop smiling and she's going to go, so I'm going to be okay because I know your story. And that's not how that works. But we have a fellowship full of nice people that think that that's all we have to do is sit in meetings day after day, sharing a story. I'm not saying the stories aren't important, guys. We got to connect. But this idea of being able to understand, look at how many times in the basic text, Bill Wilson and those guys refer us back to the chapter on alcoholism. That's what they call it. Have your husband read the chapter on alcoholism in 4 different places. That they'll do this because they want us to understand, unless I know what alcoholism is. And people always roll their eyes when I start talking about that. Some of y'all just did it a minute ago. Listen to this. Next time you're in an AA meeting, just a regular discussion meeting, bring the topic, what is alcoholism? Just bring that as a topic. And they'll be glad to hear it. They'll be, okay, I love that. And then you'll have somebody sitting there, Amy, you smiled, so I'm going to pick on you again. So Amy walks into the meeting, she sits there like this, and Amy understands what alcoholism is, and so she shares it. She shares. We've got a physical component and a mental component. We've got a spiritual piece that comes along with this stuff like that. She does a terrific job. Rock on. But let me tell you from my own experience, you'll end up with 1 or 2 people that will share that, and then you'll have one of the nicest guys in the room. They'll go, well, for me, and there it is. 90 degrees was what just happened, and you didn't see it coming. Or they'll say, well, in my case, because that's what we're taught. You see, the problem with this stuff is that at the moment that we take it out of the text and make it all about our story, we begin to confuse people. You see, I listen to people talking about eating out of dumpsters and doing all this, having sex with collie dogs and doing all kinds of weird stuff. And I'm just looking there going like, whoa, well, stop. I didn't do any of that stuff. I didn't do any of that stuff. Maybe that means that I'm not an alcoholic. You see what I'm saying? Alcoholism has a face, and we need to be able to describe what that is so that we can help people understand. Any of y'all ever mentioned, this is kind of funny to me, but any of y'all ever been in a discussion meeting and mentioned the word qualifying or said the word qualifying? Holy cow. I mean, people's ears, their hair explodes into flames and there's smoke coming out of their ears, and they're going, whoa, wait, we don't talk about that. We're not trying to be exclusive. We don't want to run people off. I said, no, whoa. I'm not trying to run anybody off. For 7 years, I sat in these rooms, scratching my head and looking across the table and going, I don't know if I'm like that. I don't know. Maybe I just made a lot of bad decisions. Maybe I just made some bad decisions, and that's the reason why I got in trouble and did the things that I did. But I'm 7 years down the road. Maybe it's okay. We see people every day building cases against us until finally they just say, oh, heck with it. I'm just going to leave. What I really wished had happened was that somebody had grabbed me when I was a week sober and said, "Buddy, can we sit for a couple of minutes and let's talk about a couple of things." In the basic text, page 44, that first little paragraph on we agnostics is my favorite place to take people when they're new. And I've got 100 different ways to slide in sideways and get them to open up to that page like that. But we'll have this conversation. It's one paragraph, and it asks two questions about choice and control. Choice and control. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely. There's no story in there anywhere to confuse things. We've already talked about the story stuff. We've already done that. But they're asking two qualifiers, and if your answer is yes and yes, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. Welcome. There's not. But later in the text, actually it's earlier in the text. They're gonna connect the dots and go, okay, if you're an alcoholic, then you have a disease that is chronic in nature, and it gets worse, never better. You see, and so which is terrifying to finally connect up and realize. I mean, how many of y'all got kind of emotional when you connected up the dots that there's some true insanity in your life? I mean, how many of you guys walked up to somebody you absolutely loved and said, "I will never, ever, ever drink again"? And people make funny jokes and they say, "Well, you know, if an alcoholic's mouth is moving, he's lying." Stop. How many of you told loved ones that you would never do it again, and you truly meant it when you said it? Me. And then later I did it again and again and again. And I used to be a member of a big Pentecostal church, and man, I've had 1,000 hands on me with people praying on me and all kinds of stuff. And I still drank. And it wasn't until somebody said, "Myers, let me see if I can explain what insanity around that drink looks like." And the moment I connected up that around the drink I was insane, then it became real easy to connect up the rest of the dots, and I was fine. One more real quick thing: I always mention Don Fritz in some of these talks, and I do because Don Prince was an iconic AA guy in the 60s and 70s. He was a sweetheart of a guy, and really pretty special. He sobered up in the federal penitentiary system in Denver, Colorado, and I think he spent the first 2 years of his sobriety in jail, and then when he got out, he was just sort of amazing. Well, in some of these early talks that he did, one in particular he said, "I'm concerned," and I think this was in the late 60s when this one, or at least the talk that I heard was in the 60s. He said, "I'm concerned that these days we spend more and more time talking about sobriety and less time talking about recovery." I want to be sure that I'm totally digging sober. I'm never ragging on being sober like that. But the in the words of my buddy Mickey Bush, so's the cat. I mean, after a while, guys, the sober part is not the part that's so effective. It's not the part that's so amazing. It's the recovery part. It's the fact that I can get up in the morning, take a deep breath, sit on the edge of my bed, talk to my creator, and get out there and kick butt, take names. I can go out there and have the kind of life that I always dreamed that I could have. And I'm not this crazy guy walking around with a trigger list, afraid that I'm going to do something stupid that's going to get me drunk. Guys, recovery means that I have recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. I will always be an alcoholic, always like that. But the obsession has been removed. The insanity is gone. There's not any of this suddenly stuff that happens like this, because I've recovered from that hopeless state. And that is flat special. And the problem, guys, the thing that gets me, y'all, is that if you don't see that, then your recovery can become more and more of a burden. And you'll find yourself at 10 years sober, not digging it nearly as much. And at 20 years, you're just kind of like, damn, is this all, I just got to go to 3 meetings a week and mark it off my list. And you're sharing the same story over and over again. And you're not doing the things that you're supposed to do. The $64,000 question, I think, is where are we around these disciplines that I was talking about just a minute ago? Let me close with this. There was a guy sent me an article years ago from Akron, Ohio, from their newsletter, and at the bottom of it, there's a little piece in italics at the very bottom of the page, and it said, "Alcoholics, the only people on the face of God's green earth that takes what works and then stops doing it." And I'm thinking that he nailed it. He nailed it. When you get crazy and you start moving back towards booze, it's not because you stop going to meetings. It's because you stop those disciplines of 10, 11, and 12. My prayer life is non-existent, and I'm not working with anybody. I mean, you want to see what excitement looks like in AA, what true healthy stuff looks like? Go get you some AA commitments to carry a message and teach the big book, and then get you some little knuckleheads to sponsor. And I promise you, your life will be transformed forever. And you'll find yourself totally digging the fact that you can help others, which is what we want to do. I better hush up. Y'all got more important things to do. Listen, thanks for letting me come visit, okay?